Welcome back to our live coverage, of course, here from Midrand in Gauteng, our live coverage of the Democratic Alliance's Federal Congress. About an hour from now, we should actually have the result of the leadership contest between Mpho and John Steenhuisen. Many political parties with long histories in South Africa are people who in some ways are sort of walking and living memories of the party's early days. Think of the role Andrew Mlangeni used to play, for example, in the African National Congress. For the Democratic Alliance, that role is probably played by Douglas Gibson, someone who's been a part of the DA, well, long before there was a Democratic Alliance. In fact, depending on how you look at the history of the DA, going all the way back to 1970. He was, for a time, also our ambassador to Thailand, and he joins me now. Mr. Ambassador, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Please call me Douglas. You make me sound like a mummy from Tutankhamun's tomb. And I'm sure I'm still very much alive.
Well, Douglas, we've known each other for a long time in many ways. You joined politics in the United Party, if I remember correctly, which was one of the forerunners of the DA a long time ago. I mean, when you go back all the way to the 1970s and you see where South Africa and where this party is now, an awful lot's changed.
Well, certainly it was a different world. I mentioned to you that I became involved in politics in 1950. When I was 8 years old, I told my father I was going to Parliament. And he said, "Why do you want to go to Parliament?" And I said, "I want to fight the Nats." And he told me, "Well, then you'd better learn to speak Afrikaans," which I did. If only he'd given me the advice to study Zulu and Xhosa and a few other languages. But it was a different world.
It was certainly, formal politics then was white only. You look at how diverse the Democratic Alliance is now. I mean, the party itself has changed from 1994 when it fought those elections, didn't do particularly well. Then there was the merger with the National Party to form the DA in 2000. And now, 23 years later, what for you has been the biggest change?
Well, I think the fact that the DA now reflects South Africa. If you come and look at the faces at this Congress, far more than half are black South Africans, and that's a reflection of our branches and our constituencies and the regional organizations and so on. The myth has grown up that the DA is a white party, and of course that's assiduously pressed by people who are themselves totally uniracial, like the ANC. I mean, the ANC had to appoint Mr. Koornoff now to the NEC so they could have one white Afrikaans-speaking person. Well, we've got quite a few here, but we've got a hell of a lot of black people here, and it makes me proud. And it also, of course, is a reflection of what happens out in the street with the voting. White South Africans are now 7.7% of South Africa. Those whites don't all vote for the DA, but the DA is, according to the current polls, standing at 26%, which means about a quarter of our supporters are white and the rest are not white, which again is reflected by this Congress. And that's what makes my heart glad, because I'm a proud South African, but a South Africa that includes everybody.
When you look at the recent history of the DA, and John Steenhuisen was talking about this a little earlier, and there was the sort of problem of 2019. I call it the problem because from 1994 onwards, the Democratic Alliance famously, and used to say this all the time, you probably said this all the time too, had increased its share of the vote in every election, and then didn't. And I remember as the Gauteng results came in that election in 2019, and speaking to Mmusi Maimane, leader of the DA as he then was, it was apparent to everybody that there was a problem for the DA. When you look at all of that now, what do you think went wrong for the Democratic Alliance? Was it just that Jacob Zuma was no longer president?
I think that was a big factor. People were so relieved to have Cyril Ramaphosa instead of Zuma that I think a lot of our natural supporters probably voted for him. But, you know, I think the fact is that Musi, nice as he was, talented as he was, great speaker, and really a decent human being, he was not a leader who could give the party a firm lead in the correct direction. He was inclined, unfortunately, I was a friend of his. I'm not sure I'm still a friend of his, but anyway, I'm happy to be friendly. He listened to everybody and then took a wavy course. You can't do that in politics. You must go back to basics, what your party stands for, what it wants to do for South Africa, what it wants to do for the people of South Africa. That's what's important.
Do you believe the party's doing that now?
I think we're doing it to a much greater extent than we were. I think John has done a very good job. I support him and I like him. He's a decent guy. He's the sort of chap you'd sit down and have a beer with and swap a joke or two and some stories. But he's also very clever. I mean, there's this nonsense about, oh, well, he hasn't got a doctorate or he hasn't got some sort of a degree. Well, I've got a couple of degrees, and that doesn't make me cleverer than him. I think he's a good leader. You've mentioned that the results are going to come out soon. I am expecting that he'll win quite big.
When you look through the sort of history of South Africa from the role that you've been playing from the 1970s onwards, leadership really matters. And I mean, the United Party arguably fell apart because it had quite a weak leader in Sir de Villiers Graaff at the time, if my memory of what for me is history is correct. Leadership really matters in politics, doesn't it? I mean, leadership is absolutely crucial. If you look at the history of the ANC and the DA, you can probably see that.
Yes, I think that's true. Just in de Villiers Graaff's defense, I mean, there were lots of people who adored him, and he was just there for too long. I think he was there for 27 years, I can't remember how many years. But, you know, you reach the end of your shelf life. And not only did he reach the end of his shelf life, so did the United Party, and it eventually went out of existence. The great party of General Smuts that had been there during the war, nothing left. But very similar to the National Party. I mean, the National Party dominated South Africa for 47 years, I think it was, from 1948. And by 2000, it had shriveled away to nothing, because they elected Martinus van Schalkwyk, who was hardly in the caliber, or of the caliber of some of his predecessors, awful as they had been. And so I agree with you, leadership is very important. We demonstrated that in our party with Tony Leon, who was a superb leader. He had a finger in every pie, and Tony didn't let anything get past him. I mean, I hear now about Chairman of Federal Council is actually the leader of the party. It's absolute nonsense. I did that job. I was chairman of the Federal Council and executive. Nobody ever thought that Douglas Gibson was the leader of the party. I made sure the party ran, but Tony was the leader. And I think that's the case now too, with Helen and with John.
Isn't it interesting, though, that she was the leader and then sort of came back? And when she came back, that's what led to Mmusi Maimane leaving, Herman Mashaba leaving, Athol Trollip leaving. I mean, this is, I mean, by all definitions, and I realize people have disagreements in politics, I understand that. But those three, that's good political capital that walked out the door when she came back. And they came back, they left as a direct result of her coming back into politics.
Well, that's not entirely true. Mmusi Maimane, when he announced his resignation, said straight away that the DA was no longer the vehicle for South Africa, but that he would stay on for 6 months as leader of the opposition in Parliament. I mean, the cheek of it was just unbelievable. And so then his parliamentary caucus said, no, you're not. You must go now. Helen was elected. some people were amazed that she was prepared to do it, but you just look at the standard and the caliber of the organisation of this conference. Everything works. Right, right down. Yesterday they had a problem with one of the voting systems or the sound system or something because there was a clash with the SABC. Risk had been taken into account, and there were voting cards that were produced immediately. It's that type of attention to detail that she's prepared to do, and get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do. Then you talk about Herman Mashaba left because of her. I mean, that's not true at all. Only 6 months or 9 months before he left, he described her as a wonderful human being. And it all changed. It all changed because she and a number of other people were very upset about Mashaba, who's a decent chap. I supported him. I appeared on public platforms with him. I told people you can trust him because he's very rich and he won't steal your money. Audiences like that, and he liked it too. But when he became known to the EFF as the EFF mayor of Johannesburg, and we saw all sorts of decisions being taken that the DA would not have taken, that was the problem. And he foresaw that his tenure as mayor was going to come to an end.
You made the point earlier that I think it was 7.6% of South Africa's population is white, which means that you and I sitting here talking about politics on these chairs reflect half of 7.6%, okay, to white men. Do you think the Democratic Alliance can really actually get past, say, 30% with a white male leader? I realize it's a complicated question.
Well, the answer to that is yes, I do think so. If the election of a black leader was the silver magic bullet, then why didn't it work for Maimane? He was talented, he was charming, he was good looking, he had it all. But he wasn't a leader. And the rest of South Africa didn't follow him. The black voters didn't follow him. So I think that's your answer.
What do you think is going to happen next year? You've got a lot more experience than anyone else in this party. What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, well, sometimes I am known, Tony Leon used to call me Pollyanna, because everything was always coming up roses, especially when it wasn't.
It's a very old film, that, yes.
We had some tough times when we were a 1.7% party with 7 seats in Parliament. So I do indulge in some wishful thinking, but I cannot see the ANC recovering now and getting over 50%. So I'm absolutely convinced that they're going to come short. And if that is the case, we're into coalition territory in South Africa. And it's either going to be a government, a coalition government led by them, which is probably with the EFF. They've clutched them to their bosom in Johannesburg and Tswana and wherever else you care to mention. It's either going to be them heading up a coalition or us. So it's an exciting prospect. And what I want to see is the DA getting as many votes as it can. And please, to the people of South Africa, don't waste your votes on parties that are going to have 1 member or 2 members of Parliament. It's not respectful, and I'm respectful in politics, but quite often they're rats and mice parties, and they're there for the promotion of the leader or somebody, 1 or 2 strong people, and they're not there to promote the interests of South Africa.
The campaigning's already started for the Democratic Alliance, as you can see. Douglas, it was good to see you again. Thank you very much indeed. I remember speaking to you many years ago, and you were always very available to a young and probably quite rude journalist like me, so thank you. Former ambassador to Thailand, Douglas Gibson, long-time member of the Democratic Alliance, the PRP, I think the PFP somewhere, and the United Party going all the way back to the 1970s. More coverage. We do expect a result soon from the DA's Federal Congress.